Hi everyone, my name is Georgie and I'm a co-founder of Cosmedic Supplies, and today I'm going to be taking you through your needle theory. We're going to be discussing everything from diameter to tapers, needle length, configuration, movement, depth, etc. I hope it helps and I hope you enjoy it.
The diameter is the width of the needle at its widest point, the shaft, not the tip of the needle. The diameter has an effect on the flow of pigment. The narrower the diameter, the finer and more controlled the flow of pigment will be. Thus, a needle with a narrower diameter will be ideal for precision work, i.e. hair strokes and outlining work. The density or saturation of colour increases with a larger diameter size needle. The taper is the length of the needle tip. Typically, the diameter is seen as the most important feature of a needle, but the taper plays a large part in the overall result. The taper contributes greatly to the dot, also known as the pixel, size in the skin. A shorter taper creates a larger pixel size as the widest point of the needle is closer to the tip, and therefore enters the skin at this point. A shorter taper causes more trauma and more colour saturation. The pigment reaches the skin more quickly, making a shorter tapered needle more ideal for shading and blending techniques such as pendular and whip shading. A longer taper creates a smaller pixel size as the widest point of the needle is further away from the tip, making the tip of the needle more pointed and thinner in width. A longer taper causes less trauma and therefore the colour saturation is less. It takes longer for the pigment to reach the skin, making a longer taper more ideal for precision work such as hair strokes and lining work. Medium and long tapered needles are best when performing semi-permanent makeup.
So what I'd like you to note that although a shorter tapered needle, so medium in the case of SPMU, can technically be more traumatic to the skin, they're actually a little bit more appropriate for more sensitive and delicate skin types because they don't tend to be as sharp as longer tapered needles.
The number of needles means how many are present within the cartridge. The more needles that are present within the configuration, the more pigment that will be implanted. The amount of pigment embedded multiplies the more needles that are present. This means that we can saturate the skin more quickly with less passes, therefore there is less trauma. Although this can be ideal when we are faced with challenging skin types, we must be aware that the area will saturate quickly, so we need to constantly assess our results before we continue working in order to control the amount of pigment that's implanted. Needle configuration means how the needles are grouped together inside the cartridge. There are a number of ways needles can be configured. The way the needles are configured can affect our control and accuracy. It affects the way that pigment is delivered and how the needles hit and penetrate the skin.
Round liner needles are either a configuration of needles that are packed very tightly together or they are singular needles. When you work with a configuration that is so tightly packed together, they can pack in pigment very, very quickly, sometimes quicker than what you actually realise, but also they are quite sharp, so they can penetrate deeper than the skin than what maybe you would like. And although single round liner needles are excellent, they are sort of our safety needle, but also they give you a lot of control over accuracy, you do lose control with your depth. They are very sharp. I would personally suggest that round liner needles are used with caution. I would be encouraging more experienced artists to use them, and if you're not completely confident with the depth that you're working at and that you're 100% working in your sweet spot, I would avoid using round liner needles, and I would be more encouraging you to use a round shader needle.
One round liner needles, i.e. single needles, will provide you with a lot of control with accuracy when working, but lack of control with depth. The skin's epidermis thickness varies from client to client, and 1R round needles have little resistance and can pull and snag the skin, which can cause significant trauma if used on the wrong skin type or used incorrectly. They are ideal for precision work, but should be used with caution and by experienced artists when being used to shade the skin. A multiple configured RL needle can pack in pigment very quickly and create a more saturated result rather than pixelated. When used correctly and on the right skin type, they can be used to shade an area very quickly and in less passes than a 1RL single needle.
Round shader needles are multiply configured needles that are loosely packed together, which means that they don't pack in pigment incredibly dense or as dense as an RL needle. They're nowhere near as sharp, they're definitely a little bit blunter, so they are excellent for using on sensitive skin types, those who bleed easily, without causing as much trauma or the risk of pigment migrating, working too deep, or even discolouring in the future. They can be used to pack in a lot of colour, or they can be used to create a haze of colour. They're diverse, they're safe to use, they're excellent. I would encourage everybody to have them in their clinic.
Round shader needles are multiple needles that are loosely grouped together, meaning there is more space between the needles and therefore they don't pack in as much pigment as quickly, making them ideal for shading and blending. They're a good choice of needle when wanting to create a more subtle result or when working with sensitive and delicate skin types. Magnum needles are 2 stacked and straight rows of needles. They are great for blending and shading and are also ideal for delivering a lot of colour very, very quickly. They usually have a long taper. They come in both a curved and stacked structure. Curved Magnum needles allow for softer entry to the skin and therefore risk less trauma. This means that the end needles in the configuration are shorter and they create a curved shape. Stacked Magnum needles are configured more tightly and deliver more intense results again very quickly. Use these needles with caution as they can be traumatic to use.
So due to the speed that Magnum needles can deliver pigment, minimal passes are required, therefore there is less trauma to the skin. However, I would be looking to create a very sheer and natural result because you could risk packing in far too much pigment far too quickly without realising. The skin only has a certain amount of space to hold pigment, so if you risk packing in too much, the area is just going to oversaturate, the pigment's potentially going to migrate and potentially discolour, so do use them with caution. But they are great when you're in a situation that you don't want to create a lot of trauma, you don't want to keep going over the skin. It also is going to half your working time at the speed, due to the speed that they deliver pigment, but definitely use them with caution.
The tip of an acupuncture needle is a billet shape, not a cone shape. They are far less traumatic as they have a much rounder tip and therefore easily and more softly enter the skin. Pigment is delivered more quickly with less trauma. Acupuncture needles cause less pain as well as less bruising and swelling. A U-shaped needle is similar to a flat needle. However, the outer needles become shorter and create the unique U shape. This creates a softer entry to the skin than a flat needle and can be great for creating the same desired effect as a flat needle, but without causing as much trauma. We must also take needle length into consideration, i.e. how long the needle is. When the needle is too long, pigment isn't implanting well, the skin looks irritated, warm and sore with very little colour, pigment is spraying onto the skin, you are having to apply too much pressure to implant pigment. When the needle is too short, pigment is spilling over the area you are working on. Pigment is tearing out very saturated as the whole taper is entering the skin. The longer the needle is, the longer it takes for the pigment to reach the tip of the needle, which is good for precision work. A shorter needle is good for saturation.
Just a little top tip, please don't cover the hole or the vent as it's there to release the air pressure.
There are 3 main layers of skin: the epidermis, the dermis and the subcutaneous layer. The epidermis is responsible for protection, skin renewal and shedding. The dermis is a stable layer of skin cells and houses an abundance of blood vessels. The subcutaneous layer is composed of fatty tissue and houses veins and arteries.
So if we were to tattoo within the epidermis only, the results would be very superficial, very patchy, weak, and just generally quite poor to look at. The pigment isn't going to retain, and we're more likely to cause scarring, which can look a little bit pink in colour once healed, than actually create a haze of colour throughout the area. However, if we work too deep into the skin and we risk working within the dermis and the subcutaneous tissue, the pigment is going to heal too dark, it's going to discolour, it's probably going to go quite ashy, the pigment's probably going to migrate, and you will of course something called a blowout. What we need to do is we need to tattoo right in between the epidermis and the dermis within our sweet spot. So, how do we know when we're working within the sweet spot? You need to tune into your senses. For me, it's about being able to hear something and to be able to feel something. When I say you need to be able to hear something, you need to be able to hear a scratch. You need to be able to hear that the needle is penetrating through the skin. It's not a substantial sound, it's the difference between hearing nothing and hearing something, but you do need to be able to listen out for that. It should just be a really gentle, subtle sound, a gentle scratch when you look like you're working through the skin, but you need to be able to hear that you're working through the skin as well. You also need to be able to feel a change in sensation. And what I mean by that is that when you are working through the skin, you can feel a change in sensation, the vibration that's coming up through the handpiece. There's a very subtle change that just raises through the handpiece and you can feel it in your tattooing hand. You can also feel it through your stretching fingers as well. So the fingers that you're stretching with that are resting on the skin, you should be able to feel a vibration, a sensation change coming up through these fingers too. Again, it's not substantial, it's just the difference between not being able to feel anything and just being able to feel something. But you don't want to look like you're working again, you also want to be able to feel it. So it's listening and it's feeling, and that is when you should be working within the sweet spot. Some clients are going to bleed, but the majority won't. So if you do feel like you're getting more than just a little bit of spotting, then you're probably working too deep into the skin.
We want to tattoo between the epidermis and the dermis within the sweet spot. If we work deeper than this, however, we will cause a blowout, which is when we see pigment migration and major trauma. There will be a lot of blood present and the pigment will look very dark and blurry in the skin and will only continue to get darker and blurrier. A blowout is usually the result of working too deep into the subcutaneous fatty layer where the pigment cannot sit still and it therefore migrates. The correct angle to work in SPMU is at 90 degrees. The incorrect angles are below or above 90 degrees. When assessing your angle, please ensure that you're working at 90 degrees to the curvature of the area that you are tattooing. Working below 90 degrees in particular can cause the needle to resist penetration and work underneath the skin rather than directly and gently into it. The incorrect angle will cause trauma, scarring, pigment migration, colour saturation and blowouts. The typical needle movements are pendular and whip shading techniques. There are many more, but these are your typical motions and it's important that we are working at the correct angle.
When we refer to needle stroke length, we aren't referring to how long the needle is. We're actually referring to the motor within the handpiece and how low down the handpiece the motor is or how high up the motor is. When we talk about a short stroke length, we are talking about a motor that is very close to the needle. So when the motor is retracting and pulling back to be able to then allow the needle to penetrate and hit the skin, it's not pulling back at such a long distance, it's a short distance, so the impact isn't that hard. When we are talking about a long stroke length, we are talking about a motor that is higher up in the handpiece. Therefore, the needle is pulled back at such a distance that when it hits the skin at a huge impact because of the longer distance that it is being pulled back by. When you work with a PMU device, most of the time you are working with a medium stroke length of around 2 millimeters, so it hits the skin at a nice medium impact. However, when you're working with maybe a rotary device, it's usually a longer stroke length of around 3 millimeters, so that when it hits the skin at a much harder impact. This isn't to be confused with depth. It's not a matter of the needle working deeper within the skin, it's just the impact on the skin. So you do tend to get slightly more traumatic results with a rotary device in comparison to your classic PMU device.
A low machine speed means that the needle penetrates in and out less times per second, i.e. the needle pierces the skin less times per second. This results in less pigment implanted into the skin and also less trauma. The slower the machine speed, the further apart the pixels are, and you will therefore achieve a more sheer result. A high machine speed means that the needle penetration increases and enters the skin several more times per second the higher the speed is. This results in more pigment being implanted into the skin and also more trauma. The faster the speed is, the closer together the pixels are, and you will achieve a more dense and saturated result. It's important to match the correct hand speed with the correct machine speed. We need the two aspects to work in unison. We want to match a low machine speed with a slow hand speed. If the hand speed is too fast, the needle will not have enough opportunity or time to penetrate the skin and implant pigment. The pixels will be very far apart and more work and passes will be required, resulting in more trauma. A slow hand speed and a low machine speed will space pixels further apart, rather than overlapped, and the results will be clearly visible, individual pixels and a more sheer result. We would therefore match a high speed setting with a fast hand speed. If the hand speed was too slow, the needle would over-penetrate the skin and implant too much pigment into one area. The pixels would be too close together and overlap each other, resulting in oversaturated results and traumatized skin. A fast hand speed and a high machine speed are great to use together when creating a result such as hair strokes.
Once again, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that it's been very insightful and that you've learned a lot from it. Any questions, leave them below. You can contact us at Cosmedic Supplies. You can follow me on GgBrows UK on Instagram. We're here to help and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you all next Sunday.